I think it's time to start. So very good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Abhishek Bhati. I'm the campus dean and head of learning, teaching, and student engagement at James Cook University, Singapore. And it's my honor to welcome you to the International Day of the Tropics 2021 webinar. As you may be knowing, the International Day of the Tropics is a United Nations initiative to promote tropical regions on Earth and raises awareness about the conservation strategies and celebrates the remarkable diversity that abounds this planet. There's a lot of information about the tropics in the State of the Tropics report, which were published in the year 2014, 2017, 2020, and again earlier this year in 2021. This webinar is based on UN Sustainable Development Goal 14, which is life below water. Before I start with the webinar and introduce the speaker to you, there are some housekeeping issues which I would like to share with you. First, this webinar will be recorded for publicity purposes, so I hope you all are comfortable with the recording. Attendees will be able to ask questions at any point of the webinar through the Q&A function. So please note that you need to input your questions in the Q&A tab, not in the chat tab. Q&A will be at the end of the presentation. There would be a satisfaction poll and a survey at the end of the webinar. And it's my request that please complete that poll that gives us the information to improve ourselves in the future. And if there are any technical issues, use the chat button to communicate with the event organizers. This evening, we have the International Day of the Tropics 2021 webinar delivered by Dr. Neil Hutchinson. The webinar titled Life Below the Water, Challenges in Sustainable Management and Conservation of Tropical Marine Ecosystems. Let me now introduce the speaker, Dr. Neil Hutchinson. Dr. Neil Hutchinson coordinates the Bachelor of Business and Environmental Science program at JCU and is based at our Singapore campus. His main continuing research objectives lie in the examination of interactions between species in intertidal and shallow coastal marine systems, and how such relationships are influenced by environmental factors. His research focuses on how fish utilizes coastal habitats, such as mangroves and seagrass beds, and he's currently examining the ecology of metropredators, such as bamboo sharks. Since completing his PhD in marine ecology in Hong Kong in 2000, Neil worked at a wide range of institutions, including universities, government research laboratories, and NGOs, providing research services and information to a variety of stakeholders. He advocates research that has direct implications for conservation biology and fisheries management. His work is currently supported by grants from Wildlife Reserve Singapore and the Archipelago and Island Forum. So without any further ado, I now hand over to Dr. Neil Hutchinson for his webinar. Over to you, Neil.
Hi, thank you, Abhishek. Hello, everyone. If you just give me 1 second, I will get myself plumbed in and get my slides up on the screen. Can I just check you can hear me okay, Abhishek? Okay, fantastic. Okay. Right. Well, yep. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today. It's good to see the numbers gradually creeping up. It's always interesting giving a public talk, even pre-COVID, when we were doing this sort of thing face to face. At least you get a little bit of a handle on who your audience was. But you know, when we do things online, I expect there's probably an even broader audience out there that I would normally interact with. So welcome, and let's get on with the show. So I suppose, first of all, the title, as Abhishek mentioned, Life Below the Water is a bit of a play on one of the UN's development goals, looking at marine ecosystems, looking at the world's oceans, and looking at how we can improve on the issues that we've caused, I suppose, to put it sort of in a very brief manner. I've had a lifelong fascination with the marine environment, and I consider myself very lucky to be working in it as a profession. I'll be showing my age here, but I was brought up on a TV diet of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Man from Atlantis, and Jacques Cousteau, although as a marine biologist, I should probably be ashamed to say that I actually remember absolutely zero about any of the Jacques Cousteau shows. I have many happy memories of visits to the coastline of Northumberland, where I grew up, plodding around in rock pools and discovering the marine world without the terrible 70s era TV studio sets. So I'd like to start off my presentation with the question why. Why, I suppose, are we celebrating the International Day of the Tropics? So Abhishek's already given you a bit of an introduction. So those of you who were unfamiliar with it, one of the aims, it is to celebrate diversity while at the same time highlighting some of the challenges and opportunities that nations of the tropics face. So it really does provide an opportunity for us to take stock of progress across the tropics, to share our stories from the tropics, and also for people like myself to share our expertise and acknowledge the diversity and potential that there is in the region. So it's a resident, I guess, a second why is it me talking to you today? I suppose as a resident marine ecologist here at JCU's Singapore campus, and this is an area close to my heart, as I've already mentioned. I spend my day today conducting research on marine ecosystems, and through that I often talk to students, fishers, and a broader community about my research. And so this is really a great opportunity to talk to you all about some of the challenges being faced in our region in relation to marine systems in general. Now, a bit of a proviso as I begin. This is a huge subject. A little bit of me regretted giving this title once it had all gone out. It is such a huge subject area to try and fit into 40 minutes. There's no way I'm going to be able to sum up what's happening in the world's oceans, and in an area covers over 70% of the planet. So instead, I'm going to give you a brief overview of just some of the major issues facing our marine systems globally. I'll zoom in a little bit as well to talk about some of the ways they can be tackled and challenges that we have in our own region. So this is very much a flying visit, and I apologize if there's any particular area you were hoping I would cover that I do not. Perhaps next time. Okay, so just a bit of an overview. So as my introduction said, the world's oceans, they have a vast impact on life in the tropics, from influencing our climate to providing us with resources such as seafood. And as awareness grows of how human impacts are driving change in our oceans, so do attempts to mitigate these impacts. So what I'm going to do is highlight some areas of concern and challenges, etc. But first of all, let me get started by giving you a brief introduction to marine ecosystems. Okay, so hopefully this will work. Okay. So the video I'm about to show you, so what this is it's a model produced by NASA of ocean currents around the world. So you can currently see tropical Southeast Asia just there on the screen. Two reasons I put this up, well, one, I find it very hypnotic and very calming. But the reason I have you watching this is to give you an idea of two things. The first being scale, and the second being connectivity. So as we move through this talk, as I mentioned, I'll start to bring your attention to tropical Southeast Asia, but all of the issues I'll talk to you about today, they're happening globally. They're happening throughout the tropics, and in many cases, it's global solutions that may be necessary to actually address them. Now, as we find ourselves still in this, I guess, interesting times in regards to COVID, etc., it's very easy, particularly when, for example, we're unable to visit neighboring countries or even leave our homes, to think about the world in terms of our own little bubble. But in terms of the world's oceans, I really want you to take home that idea that there is this connectivity and it's acting at a global scale. So for example, in this video here, we have ocean currents, and you have currents moving from the equator towards the poles. They're transporting heat and actually helping to regulate our climate, even if it's a bit of a circuitous route that they take. So, the world's oceans really are, extremely important to us, just for, for the life on this planet. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about ecosystems. So first of all, maybe a bit of a different definition of what an ecosystem is. So those of you who aren't familiar with it, you may be familiar from the term from day-to-day life used in different scenarios, but I want you to think about it now as a way of think about all the components of an ecological system. So a community of organisms interacting with each other and also interacting with the physical and chemical environment that they live in. So for example, in this, oops, let me just turn my laser pointer on if that will work. Aha, magic. So in here, we have an example of an ecosystem. So we have a variety of different organisms. We have benthic organisms, invertebrates. We have vertebrates, fish, for example, and turtles. They're all here. They're in the water. They're also interacting with harder structures such as mangroves, for example. So, when we talk about an ecosystem, we're talking about this whole thing as a whole, not just one individual component. Now, our oceans are huge, okay? There's a lot of ways of different ways of dividing them up. So for the sake of today, I'm going to go as simple as possible. So I'd like to think about oceanic ecosystems and coastal ecosystems. So just for today, I suppose, oceanic ecosystems, everything pretty much off the continental shelf down to these huge depths, and coastal ecosystems on the continental shelf and into the intertidal zone, which is that area that's covered and uncovered by the tide. Now, in Singapore, okay, we have relatively shallow water depths, but if you look in the regions, we do have deep ocean areas. So for example, the South China Sea reaches depths of about 5,500 meters at its deepest. Indian Ocean, just behind us, down to about 8,000 meters. So, we do have a whole range of different types of ecosystem within the region that we find ourselves in. So oceanic ecosystems, I won't talk about those too much today, but please keep these in mind. Again, all of the impacts that I'm talking about, encompass both coastal and oceanic ecosystems. This picture here is of a hydrothermal vent in the deep ocean, and you can see on this map on the right-hand side, these are generally found around the edge of tectonic plates, etc. They're sort of really novel ecosystems, very diverse, in areas that we traditionally thought of as being, well, a couple of things. One fairly barren, but then secondly, as some sort of last marine wilderness that was unimpacted by human activity. Now, the reality is it's not the case. Even though they're even more out of sight and out of mind than our coastal ecosystems, certainly important, and certainly in the tropics. Often these are found in areas where conservation and management policies and planning and strategies are still in the development stage, if at all. So, they really are ecosystems that are perhaps underappreciated, but are also probably a lot more risk than we're aware. And yes, something that we should all keep in mind, rather than ecosystems that you can visit along our coasts. So the Indian Ocean, just for example, it's home to about 36% of the world's deep sea cartilaginous species. That's things like shark and rays, and that includes the frilled shark that you can see on the left-hand side. And here we have a vampire squid that's found at depth and in deep areas of the ocean, pretty much throughout the world. Okay, so coastal ecosystems, they're very much diverse. Here are some of the main ones. A lot of these, for example, those of you in Singapore, or actually situated here in tropical Southeast Asia or elsewhere in the tropics will be familiar with most of these. So we have seagrass beds, for example, mangrove areas, coral reefs, which get a lot of the press. Other ecosystems that don't get so much press, so mudflats and sandflats that are also equally important for a variety of different reasons. Rocky shores and other less common ecosystems, at least in the tropics, things like salt marshes, for example. This picture I actually took on Sunday morning at Chek Jawa here in Singapore. And I guess what I want you to take away from this is the fact that we talk about ecosystems, and again, people often, they may read a research paper or watch a documentary about a certain type of habitat. But again, there's that thing about connectivity. So here, for example, we have areas of seagrass. This is at low tide. So at high tide, this is covered by about 2 meters or so of water. So we have seagrass areas. We have mangrove areas in the background. Some you can't see. We have rocky shore areas here. Just behind where I took this picture, there are sand flats. Just underwater here, there's coral rubble areas. And these are all connected in a variety of ways. So at high tide, you can imagine organisms moving between them. And at low tide here, this is actually a wild boar. You can maybe just see this dot here. So, they're connected in all sorts of different ways. So again, it's the whole idea of interconnectivity is really important with our oceans and ecosystems. So, throughout the tidal period, throughout different stages of their life, for example, you'll have a variety of species moving between different habitats. It may be fish, for example, using seagrass or mangrove areas as nursery grounds when they're young to hide away from predators and to find food. Larger individuals may come into these areas to hunt, or they may come into to breed, etc. So, ecosystems provide this whole range of different things, and also they export organic material and nutrients to other ecosystems offshore. Okay, so global hotspots of species richness. So, within our coastal ecosystems, I've got 2 pictures here. Species richness is basically a count of simply the number of species. So this map, these 2 maps show hotspots in terms of areas with really high numbers of species compared to others. So look at the world's oceans, so the ocean ecosystems. There are a number of different hotspots around the world, some of them linked to things such as upwelling, so where you have cold, nutrient-rich water coming up into these areas. But if you look in coastal areas, and you look down here in Southeast Asia, you'll see that we're right slap bang in the middle of a major hotspot. So we have extremely high levels of species richness, so many marine species in the area. Why? Well, there's a number of different reasons, partly due to warmer temperatures, higher metabolism, linked in with that, a variety of different dynamics in ecosystems. This all links into things like the rate of evolutionary processes, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a number of reasons, but we're lucky to be here in this very rich area of the world. Okay, that's great, and it excites me as an ecologist, being able to live and work in the tropics, and that little boy from the 1970s, northeast of England, would probably explode with joy if he knew life would take him here. But why are these ecosystems important to us? What does it matter that there are so many different types, and what have marine ecosystems ever done for us at the end of the day? Now, one way of conceptualizing this is looking at valuing ecosystems from a wholly human perspective. So what services do they provide? So we talk about ecosystem services. So this visual representation here shows different sorts of ecosystems in the middle. And then on the outside are services that those ecosystems provide to us as humans. So there are what we call provisioning services that provide us with products from ecosystems. There are regulating services that have benefits for regulation of different ecosystem processes. There are cultural benefits, and also what we call supporting services that are necessary for production of all those other ecosystem services I was talking about there. Now, a lot of work's gone into this. I'll just touch on briefly maybe on provisioning, just to give you a bit more of an idea. So here we have fish production in coastal areas. So if you think about species that perhaps are found offshore, they may be spawning offshore, but they may utilize areas of mangrove, for example. Their eggs and larvae may utilize those. So there also may be estuarine spawners also, which is habitats important for. There's a lot of work being done on this by a team over in Townsville with the main campus. But basically what this is showing you is the fact that these coastal ecosystems provide fish production in terms of nursery grounds, etc. And actually, if you look at within Southeast Asia and a bit broader in the Asia Pacific, mangroves are really very much important for supporting the commercial catch of fish. So that's many of the fish you'll get from the supermarket or the wet market, etc. Much of the catch is actually explained by the presence of mangroves or other estuarine systems. So they're very important coastal ecosystems that support fisheries. Now, the reality is that, unfortunately, here comes the doom and gloom part of the talk, I suppose, is that the world's marine ecosystems are seriously degraded. Okay, and they continue to be seriously degraded. There are a whole range of threats that are leading to these degraded ecosystems. And from a purely selfish human perspective, what this means is that when you have degradation, you also have loss of ecosystems. And linked in with this, you also have a decrease in the ecosystem services that they provide to us. So damaging these marine communities also affects human communities, affects our health. And this is a particular concern for us here in the tropics. So why? Well, this map here just shows you human population in the tropics in terms of population per square kilometer. And you can see here, Southeast Asia, we do have, again, a hotspot in terms of human population. So we do have huge populations of people living in the area. And if you look internationally, some of the predictions are that by 2025, about 75% of the world's human population is expected to live in the coastal zone, and many of the remaining 25% living near major rivers that eventually run to the coast. And just this sheer volume of people alone means that there are high levels of human activity. So zooming in to our region, what this map here shows you is a couple of things. One, that we have some areas with really high levels of human population, but also that a lot of this human population is actually concentrated around our coastal areas. So, within the region of this map here, there are about 365 million people living. About a third of them live in coastal communities, and they're relying directly on marine ecosystems for food, livelihoods, etc. And also these marine habitats contribute, a huge amount of money. I think it's over $2 billion plus US dollars a year towards economies in the region. So they're very important. Now you overlay on top of this our biodiversity. And just to give an example here, this is the coral triangle, the so-called coral triangle, which is uniquely important in the world. It's the globe's most biologically diverse region. We've got over 600 species of coral, and so about 75% or so of the world's known coral species are here. 2,500, or about 37% of the world's reef fish species. So it really is a vitally important part of the world. And this is present in an area of the world where we have some of the highest density of populations. It also occurs in a part of the world where a lot of the nations where those people are living are still, I guess, so-called developing nations, okay? So a lot of people equals a lot of impacts. And also, in some cases, it means that perhaps the resources to try and deal with those impacts are more limited than they are elsewhere. Which brings me on to impacts. So There are a whole range of different threats that we are seeing from human activity on our planet. I'll cover a few of them today. Again, I fortunately don't have time to cover all of them, but some of the major ones I will just touch on here. So, for example, marine pollution, and whether that be sort of pollutants, chemicals, etc., being pumped into water, whether that be something like plastics, which you'll all have heard a lot about the last few years about the issues with plastic pollution in marine ecosystems. I wanted to stick this picture up because I mentioned our deep ocean ecosystems earlier on, and this is actually all litter that's been collected by a variety of researchers around the world from these deep areas. So, for example, these pictures in sea were collected from 3,000 meters below the water surface. A to C, I think this is 1,200, 2,000, again, 1,200. So, rubbish is getting everywhere. And if you think about, I guess, ocean pollution, and you won't be able to read much of this, it's more of to jog my memory, but we've got things like plastic waste, you've got oil spills, which, you'll see on the television when and where they happen. We've got chemicals that are manufactured spilling into the oceans by a variety of different methods, pesticides, and excess of nutrients. So you perhaps don't think of that as pollution, but it's what we call eutrophication, and that's where you have, it can be down to a number of things, down to rainfall, etc., excess use of fertilizers on land. It can be down to removal of forests, for example, on the side of rivers that mean that excess nutrients are getting into rivers and find their way into the oceans. And eutrophication is this excess of nutrients that causes its own issues. It can cause mass blooms of microalgae that then can have an effect of depleting oxygen. It can then have a knock-on effect of killing a lot of organisms that are found in ecosystems. And you end up with things like dead zones. There are parts of the world's oceans that pretty much have nothing living in them these days. Okay, so just moving on from that, I'll just touch on these briefly. So something else here is coastal development and habitat loss. So I mentioned habitat loss. I'm also talking about habitat fragmentation, which is where habitat isn't just lost completely, but you may have large areas of habitat being broken into smaller areas of habitat that function slightly differently and may not be as valuable at the end of the day as that original large patch was. But anyway, this picture here, any of you who've had the opportunity to spend time here in Singapore, you'd be well aware of the amazing development along our coastlines. For example, the land that you can see here, this is all reclaimed, or rather I should say claimed, because reclaim sort of suggests that the sea borrowed it and we've taken it back. But all this has been reclaimed. Okay, so there's a huge number of reasons that Singapore's done this. Anyone interested in seeing future plans, Singapore is very good at sort of producing these plans. You can find them on the Urban Redevelopment Authority's website. But the reality is that any sort of development of this nature, any sort of reclamation or climation, involves burying ecosystems that were previously there under them. So it leads to habitat loss. It also leads to fragmentation of ecosystems into smaller parts, as I mentioned already. Just to give you an idea, this is a map of Singapore's CBD from back in 1836. This is pretty much the corner of East Coast Park. And if I draw a line here with my laser pointer across to, a relatively straight line across to here, all of this area has been reclaimed. So it's, Marina Bay is within here. We've lost sand flats, for example, over the sort of 180 years or so. Those sand flats and mud flats have disappeared. Estuarine ecosystems have gone. And with a growing population elsewhere in the world and elsewhere in the tropics, and increasing know-how, this has been done over a long period in Singapore. We're going to see reclamation and habitat loss like this at a dramatic scale along the world's coasts. So on the subject of habitat loss, So this image here is from a paper published a few years ago, looking at changes in usage and how that affects habitat loss. So for example, what it's showing is percentage of mangrove deforestation. It's the percentage of mangrove that's been lost between 2000 and 2012, and the dominant use that was made of that land once the mangrove was removed. So these circles, so the land use summarizes basically the different circle types. Different colors represent the use that it's now being used for, and the size of the circle, and the larger the circle, the larger the percentage of the mangrove area that was lost in that particular area. So you can see that sort of throughout Southeast Asia, we're losing huge swathes of mangrove, and I said those mangroves provide really important ecosystem services to us, and yep. They are being put to other uses, but oh yeah, there's the little pink dot here. Yes, there's mangrove there, but it's not the same form of mangrove that's there beforehand. But anyway, so we're losing coastal ecosystems like this quite dramatically, and this is still going on. Another major issue, so this is something that's been in the news because of various documentaries and things recently, but overfishing is one of the other big threats that we have, and I talk about overfishing, I'm referring to one of a range of unsustainable fishing practices. So fundamentally what this means is it's harvesting of fish at a rate where they're unable to sustain themselves, and the population's declining in the long run. Now, while the industry itself may be sustainable in some places, this over-extraction of fish, it's relatively common, and many fisheries are not sustainable. In some countries, they've made a lot of headway, in a lot of places, there still is headway to be made. There are a lot of researchers working on this. There are a lot of people out there working with the fishing industry and conservation groups, etc., towards making fishing sustainable and using sustainability and sustainable fishing as a means of management. So tackling not just overfishing, but also aiming to reduce habitat destruction and bycatch of species, etc. And talk about fishing production, I'll just go this very quickly. But basically, we do have capture fisheries are huge. Aquaculture now outstrips our capture fisheries. But we do still have what this graph doesn't tell a tale of is the fact that since 1990, even though it looks as though there's a plateauing off, actually there was a 14% increase from 2017 to 2018 in terms of capture fisheries, but it looks as it's been plateauing off. What is happening is that the percentage of fish stocks that are biologically sustainable has dropped in this period of time. So even though the overall tonnage in terms of millions of tons may not be increasing at the rate that it is with something like aquaculture, it still is a huge issue. And we do have countries in the region that are sort of top, I suppose, capture producers. So China, Indonesia, Vietnam, for example, as well as further afield, Peru, India, Russian Federation, the US, and those countries altogether make up for about 50% of total global capture production. What about fishing pressure? Well, what's been happening is that as fisheries are depleted inshore, a lot of fishing activity is moving further offshore, and there have been sharp declines in fisheries catches over time. There's a website called Global Fishing Watch. If you want, you can go and have a look at the sort of the larger fishing vessels, what's happening right now, and it shows you some hotspots in the region. Okay, and then I suppose the last, but the big one, I suppose, in many ways, of the major threats is climate change. So what this image shows you is changes in sea temperature from sea surface temperature from 1901 to 2020, and our region, as you can see here, it's certainly not immune to these impacts. Okay, so we do have these impacts occurring. What kind of impacts are there of climate change? A few. We have obviously warming of our coastal areas. There can be less oxygen in our water, partly linked to that. Also, as the CO2 is absorbed, which is linked to warming as well, and excess CO2 production, our ocean is becoming more acidic. So there's a whole knock-on range of effects of that. We have habitats disappearing because of changes to oxygen levels. We have disruptions to fisheries, for example, where we have food webs changing. We have bleaching of coral. We have rise of sea level. A whole range of different impacts linked to this particular threat. Many of them, what will happen once the impacts occur is unpredictable. So for example, if you have a new species with global warming, with the warming oceans, you have species in the tropics. As the waters warm away from the tropics, those species will be able to move further and further into those waters they weren't able to access initially. And it's very difficult to predict what will happen when they get there. What will they feed on? What will feed on them? But also on the other end here in the tropics, a lot of our marine species are really at the edge of their physiological tolerance. So once temperatures get above a certain point, they're very uncomfortable there. And so, we may have a loss of some species in the tropics as well. Now, to make matters worse, and what a major concern is the fact that none of these threats act in isolation. Okay, they all act in a variety of different overlapping ways. And what this image shows you here is it's a map of human impacts. So it includes all sorts of different human impacts. And again, in our region, you can see some areas of very high impact where those different threats are all interacting and leading to some really sort of major impacts that are of concern in our region. And this particular map, these researchers did this in 2008, redid it in 2017, and found things were actually even worse than they originally expected. Okay, so what we have affecting the world's oceans is what we call wicked problems. Okay, so they're extremely complex, they're difficult to define, there's often no clear solution, they're socially complex. So, where to start? And it's one of those things when you put everything together, and I have to say that when I was putting this talk together, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by everything. However, after stepping back and like me, perhaps giving your dog a good pat, I remember one of our great resources that we have, and that's people. We have people out there from many countries in our region and internationally who have a huge range of different experiences in marine ecosystems. We have scientists, recreational divers, fishers, school kids walking around in rock pools. You get the idea. And there's a huge will these days out there to reduce some of the impacts that we are seeing. There's a diverse group of people, and this should be seen as a positive. So those of you out there, perhaps in the next generation, keep on fighting the good fight, basically. So there's a whole diversity of ideas and approaches out there. And what we need to be able to do is to use these and utilize these to solve some of these issues that humanity are responsible for. Now they're complex. So this diagram here from a paper by Rao et al. So we have, I suppose, in terms of anthropogenic threats, we have conventional, like pollution, overfishing. We have unconventional threats like warming, acidification. They're all impacting species and ecosystems. And the outcome for those species and ecosystems eventually is they're either conserved or unconserved. Now, in terms of those systems, how to determine where to put the effort into involves scientific work out there to assess, to measure and monitor what's happening in ecosystems. So the science comes into it. Then, theoretically, that science will hopefully inform policy. And a really vital part of that policy is inputs from societies, from a whole range of different stakeholders. So I'll talk about stakeholders again in a minute, but in an ideal situation, your policies then go on to provide intervention or management strategies in order to try and turn some of these issues around. And these are shared issues. Okay, no nation is alone. And through collaboration, just maybe we can turn some things around or at least lessen their impact. That said, it would be naive, however, to think that there are not large challenges ahead of us. Now, one of these is the scale of these problems. So climate change, for example, it's a truly international issue that we're being impacted by here, but also obviously it's an impact caused by nations around the world. And it really requires international solutions as well as local solutions. So you have, for example, two different strategies. There's mitigation, which is actions to reduce or remove the impacts. And that really requires a lot of effort at most times sort of a larger scale. And you've also got adaptation, which is adjusting to these changes that are occurring in order to moderate their impacts further down the line or exploit the potential new benefits. And that's something people often don't think about in terms of climate change, is that there'll be winners and losers. So you may be in an area, for example, where you'll suddenly have a boom in terms of fisheries because a new species may be moving in. Again, very difficult to predict. But what we need to do is we need to make plans for different scenarios so that we can manage the impacts as we go along. So it's adaptive management sort of strategies. Now, I want to just put this image up. It's not picking on ASEAN. This is, a global issue, is that there's often, I suppose, a versus sort of situation between geopolitics and international collaboration. Now, I won't pretend to be an expert in this area whatsoever, but there are frameworks that exist enabling sharing of information, the development of collaboration, etc. But sometimes national interest does trump, selfless collaboration. Now, it's an international issue. It's not one I'm equipped to address. I'll leave it to any political scientists out there amongst you. But it's something that, at least, we need to be aware of. Something else that's an issue that we have to deal with related to this, I suppose, is resource conflict. And this is a picture of a few years ago. The fisheries minister down in Indonesia was taking a very hard approach in terms of illegal fishing and was destroying foreign fishing boats that legally fished in Indonesian waters. I mean, resource conflicts do happen, and that does make conservation and management more difficult as well. And also, I'm sure most of you have seen, this map or one that's similar. There are a lot of disputes in the region in terms of things, well, I say as simple as, but in terms of, maritime boundaries, for example. So, that includes, Singapore and Malaysia. There are disagreements we have about certain areas of our maritime border. The same thing's happening further afield between Australia and PNG, for example. But it's something that, we have to work around in order to make a difference. That said, there are a wide variety of different apparatuses available to us for us to use at the international level for collaboration. So the collaborative treaties, for example, such as CITES, which is the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species, and that's an endangered agreement between governments to reduce trade in endangered species. And this map shows the nations signed up to it. In fact, all UN nations are signed up to it. The degree that they actually follow through that varies, but it is something that's important to have out there. On the flip side, we do have other conventions that are available, but perhaps aren't taken up as much and don't involve as many nations. So, for example, the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of wild animals, but is something that has been developed to provide a platform globally to conserve those species that don't respect national borders and travel over very large areas. And the green countries here are non-parties; they are not signed up to it. The blue countries are a party. Of course, every nation will have its own reasons for being signed up or not signed up. But for example, species of shark or dugong, etc., that are covered under this particular convention, and it's very useful in order to try and encourage that international collaboration I talked about. Okay, one thing that we have, I suppose, not the luxury, but we need to make sure that we do here in the tropics, particularly where we're starting off research or starting off work in areas that perhaps it has been done more in other countries, is learning lessons from elsewhere. So learning lessons, for example, in places where marine planning has been put into place. So marine protected areas, for example, have been designed, but those plans have been ineffective. So learning those lessons, we don't make the same mistakes. Also learning from things like inadequate or uninformed management. So for example, you may have adaptive management strategies that have been developed in some places, which perhaps weren't based on science. And this happens a lot in things like fisheries management. There's a bit of a fulcrum around how much in terms of policy, etc., is based on the science and how much is based on what a government thinks it can get away with in terms of voter pushback, etc. Oops. Okay, something else that we really need to make sure that we do in the region is that we don't ignore the big issues. So climate change, it really needs to be included in strategies we may have, even if it's for species at a local or regional level. We also need to think about the impacts potentially of things such as biological invasions when you have species entering an area that weren't perhaps there beforehand. And finally, I'll touch about this in a second, is obscure and non-inclusive practices in terms of the way we go about doing what we do in terms of trying to protect our systems. Okay, so I notice I'm starting to run out of time here, so I'll jump over a couple of sections, but I'll just cover a couple of main areas. One is stakeholder engagement. Okay, so while conserving marine ecosystems requires managing resources, it really boils down to managing those with people and management of people. Now, when I first started off being interested in marine environment, it's probably because I was perhaps a bit socially awkward, better dealing with animals, more interested in animals than I was with people. But if you're looking at conserving and managing marine ecosystems, people are an unavoidable and very important part of the whole story. So whether you're talking about developing marine protected areas, encouraging protection of resources for, say, blue carbon sequestration, management of fisheries, etc., engaging stakeholders is a really vitally important part of that. Not only so that they understand what's going on, but so that there's ownership, so they can have involvement. And also there's a lot of knowledge in the stakeholder groups that will potentially be of use to management strategies. Okay, I'm just going to skip over a few slides here. So I was going to talk a bit more about fishing, but I'll skip over that. And what I'd just like to finish with really is something that, those of you out there who are researchers, it's something that we need to take care of. And that's poor researcher behavior. So now I read an interesting magazine article and research paper about this in the last week or so. And one area of this is parachute science. This is where, a lot of my colleagues in tropical nations out there, pre-COVID, have probably been dealing with this on a very regular basis. And that's the practice of international scientists parachuting into other countries to conduct field research. It's problematic because there's often no communication or engagement with the local scientific community, no understanding of current projects. It's a double whammy in terms of, here in the tropics, we do have these hot spots in terms of biodiversity and also impacts. And in many cases, for us to obtain research permits to conduct our research as local researchers, it take a long period of time. And having researchers fly under the radar, carry out research without local collaborators, without research permits in some cases, is very much unequitable. So there's a few ways of different ways of dealing with this. One is obviously we need to work together. We need to collaborate more as research scientists. Okay, there are the vast majority of my colleagues in any nation are equally as competent. So this whole, I suppose, semi-colonial way of looking at things really needs to go away. So here in the tropics, we do have, in the subtropics, we do have the the benefit that we are relatively close to each other. We can collaborate together. We can help each other out. We can help plug the gaps that there may be in terms of expertise. Hopefully we can work together to mitigate the issues that are out there in our marine systems. Deep breath. So thank you very much. As I said, it's a whistle-stop tour. I could have talked about this for hours. I'm not sure you would have been willing to listen, but for hours I could have talked about this. So I'll move on to question session. I'll just stop sharing my slides, and I'm happy to talk to you all and answer the questions that I can to the best of my ability. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil, for that insightful presentation. For 140 over audience that we have today, JCU, takes pride in our location in the tropics and the way we make a difference to the tropical ecosystems, whether it's in Asia or worldwide or even in Australia, through our impactful research about marine science, about environment, circular economy, sustainable world, and also through our programs that are offered here in Singapore campus and of course our campuses in Australia. There are several questions that are coming through, Neil, and being the host and the moderator, I think I have the privilege of asking the very first question.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for educating me about the extent of interconnectedness of life underwater and how that impacts life on land. The two UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goal 14 and 15. I recall reading very recently about this expedition to Emden Deep, one of the, probably it's part of the Philippine Trench. And the scientists got excited to see something there, and that was nothing but, a piece of plastic. So, my question basically is about impact of human life, change in land use through industrialization, through more urbanization, and even, through runoffs through agriculture, and then how that has impacted, let's say, your area of expertise, which is the intertidal zone and the ecosystem at the intertidal zone, Neil.
Again, a big question. I could give a big answer and keep it long as a piece of string, but I suppose, look, it's many of these impacts. There are global impacts. You look at things like warming, and there are more localized impacts. So you may have some areas where land management, for example, is better than others, in which case you expect there to be less runoff of fertilizer, etc., from agriculture, perhaps less eutrophication, and perhaps, at least in that particular aspect, a less impacted coastal ecosystem. You do visit some areas in Singapore where you have very thick biofilms on rocks, which are, a biofilm is basically a layer made up of microscopic algae and diatoms. And there's certainly some spots in Singapore that I've seen which are often close to where you have, nutrient-rich water perhaps running in, which are much thicker than you'd expect to see otherwise. So yeah, you can have very localized issues, and I guess that's part of the complexity. Is we have, as I said, there's these whole different, very different threats and impacts in some ways, but what our ecosystems have to deal with is the fact that everything interlocks. So it just makes these issues, it needs a lot of hard work to try and tease them apart and determine, what is it that's causing particular impact, but B, then work on, what those potential solutions are.
I appreciate that. Thanks for that. So we have lots of questions coming in fast, and we've already reached double figures. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to do justice to all of them, but I'll try my best to combine them. And a quick look shows that there are questions on impact on marine life, and there are others related to fisheries. But let me start by a popular question, which is, there are 2 thumbs up to that question, and that is about sea piracy and consumption.
Uh,
of fish. And the question here is, will sustainable fishing or aquaculture able to change things?
Okay, I see. So yeah, so this question, so it's about, they mentioned Seaspiracy, so that it's a documentary that was released that talks about particularly commercial fishing, and it's very much. I mean, look, there are a number of, there's quite a bit of informative information in it, but also there are a number of issues, and I can provide a link to people that talks through some of the issues, perhaps, in terms of inconsistencies that they introduce in that. I mean, look, as humans, I think that ultimately, we're going to have to be smart about what we eat, and the way that we get the food. So whether that be, I think, sustainable fishing by itself, if we do reach a target of having all sustainable fisheries, fantastic. But what that means is that there's going to be a limit in terms of the amount of captured seafood that you can extract from the environment. Okay, if it's sustainable, great. It means that limit will be continuous, but there's a limit. Aquaculture, that is, a lot of work going on. So here at JCU, for example, here in Singapore, we've got a large aquaculture team, working in this area. Again, it's a way of getting the seafood in a different way. So the technology for aquaculture has changed a lot in the last few decades. In some places, in other places, we're still, where a lot of, for example, that map I had of mangrove loss, and there was aquaculture growth there. A lot of the development still happening in this region isn't keeping pace with those developments in technology and improvements in sustainability and things like that. So there's still, as aquaculture technology improves, and there's some great work going on in that, there also needs to be a push to get people in the aquaculture industry using those technologies, etc. Also, of course, this, seafood is a prime source of protein for a lot of people around the world. But yeah, that there are other sources of protein. So I think it was yesterday I saw on the news about some some of the largest sort of artificial meat or seafood plant just being developed somewhere. And look, and I think that as we move forward, what's likely going to happen is that we will have a broader range of resources where we'll get our protein from. We won't just be reliant on capture fisheries, because there'll be a finite amount of capture fishery for us to reach a sustainable level we can actually use. Not just aquaculture. That's a big one. But there'll be a diverse stream of different areas, I guess.
Thanks. I think your last comment segued to the next question, and probably the only question I'll take on fisheries before I move on to the impact on the environment and marine science. And that relates to, fish from aquaculture farms can be, can be harmful to the immunity system or sicknesses, and which can eventually spread to humans. And I'm not sure whether there's area of expertise, but the question here is, so how can we fish in a way that has the least damaging impact on our environment?
Okay, so that's yes. I guess, look, with aquaculture, as I said, things are, a lot of the aquaculture farms, etc., that we still see in Southeast Asia, a lot of them are using techniques that we've had for hundreds of years plus. Modern techniques are getting much better at cutting down on issues. So, in terms of escapes of fish, in terms of disease, etc. A lot of those are sort of aquaculture management practices, and it's working on tweaking those. In terms of, if you're looking at sustainable capture fisheries, as I said, look, if we could flick a switch tonight and make all capture fisheries either sustainable, which they're certainly not at present, that would also, we'd have a limit. So you have a limit in terms of how many fish you can take out for that population to be sustainable. You take out too many fish, that impacts the population starts to plummet. And there are plenty of examples of these crashes in populations. If you look at fisheries sort of research, throughout the sort of last 100 years or so, whether it be the Gulf of Thailand, whether it be off the coast of the Americas, where, we fished out one species, we move on to the next one. So in terms of sustainable fishing practices, it's, again, fishing's changed. We have these huge, factory fishing vessels out at sea. The technology they're using is getting better at catching fish. So, managing the way that they operate, for example, managing different fishing equipment types. So, for example, Hong Kong a few years ago, they banned trawl fishing in Hong Kong, which, trawl fishing can be particularly destructive of benthic ecosystems, those on the seabed. So it's a whole range of different things. I mean, I'm, for example, involved in a research project with a industry collaborator here in Singapore and a partner university in Indonesia, and we're looking at how we can try and encourage sustainable fishing in terms of catch and release in the sort of artisanal / semi-commercial semi-commercial sort of industry, where people are catching fish that are undersized, they release them, and there's a benefit further down the line. So, I mean, fisheries science is a vast area, and there's a number of different angles that you can come at it from. But I think, even if I said we could flip a switch tonight and make out all these capture fisheries sustainable, we do have to be aware that there's a finite level of fish we can extract, and that we are still reliant on other methodology, like aquaculture or other new technologies that they come out.
Thanks. So let's turn our attention to, let's say, the ecosystem and the impact of the current, climate change and other things. Bobbin asked the question on whether it's possible to restore ecosystems and whether that's effective. Thomas has a similar question, which is, are there any unforeseen challenges that we have that you can direct us or alert us to? And another anonymous attendee has queried, what approaches are there to finance protection of forests and natural ecosystems? It's more to do with restoring ecosystems or anything. Which is,
well, I mean, look, the ideal situation is that you're able to protect ecosystems before they get to that tipping point, before they start going downhill. When they do, I think that the approaches are in terms of, you need this. I mean, I'm biased as a scientist, but you really need the science in terms of what makes up that ecosystem in order to understand perhaps how you need to restore it successfully. And that goes even more for, you see it in you do see it quite a bit where there may be a coastal development, and a developer may say, oh, well, you'll lose this area of mangrove or seagrass, but we'll replant an area over there, and it's like for like. I mean, the reality is it's never like for like. A natural marine ecosystem is extremely complicated. There are a lot of interactions between different species. And it's understanding, I suppose, what the most important interactions are to get those stepping stones on the way to recovery. So you may have quite a sort of network of different interactions in different species, but perhaps some of the species, for example, if they're grazing on algae, what are the species that are having the most impact there? If there are species that are, say, predators that keep numbers of other species like sea urchins down, for example. If you lose your predatory fish, you may have a boom in the number of sea urchins that they may eat. Those sea urchins then have a knock-on effect on the ecosystem that's there as well. So understand those interactions is really important if you are looking at looking at recovery, looking at restoration. It's not, unfortunately, just a case of, say, with mangrove or of seagrass of just gardening. You do need to look at things in more depth. Otherwise, you may end up with either a restoration that doesn't work and that fails, or you may end up with an ecosystem that you restore or that you create that doesn't really bear any resemblance to that natural ecosystem. So therefore, what you've created is rather than the sort of healthy ecosystem, degraded ecosystem, you've ended up with something else completely different. Yeah. So doing the research is really important. In terms of financing, so there's a whole level of different. I mean, look, none of us as researchers or conservationists have enough money, and we probably never will. But it really depends a little bit on project types. There are sort of some of the big international funders like World Bank, etc., who perhaps look at larger collaborative international projects that may involve researchers and also different stakeholder groups, whether that be government, whether that be fishers, conservation groups, etc. Large international sort of projects that try and tackle some of these wicked problems. If it's something that's more localized, then look, this is something that I deal with, the struggle for funding myself on a regular basis, and it's a case of there may, for example, in Singapore, there are wildlife reserves. They fund some conservation work, which is great. It's kept me going on my shark work for the last few years, and I'm very grateful for that. There's also NParks, they do work with researchers and other groups. So there's a whole range, and there's also people out there utilizing things like crowdfunding. NGOs, a lot of their funding comes from people knocking on doors and identifying donors and etc. It may be a project that it's potential for getting local or national government support. There's really not a one size fits all, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's a struggle for everyone out there working in these areas, getting the funding, and it's a case of keeping at it, diversifying potential routes of funding, and spinning projects in a way that perhaps are more suited for the one funding agency than another, I guess.
Thank you, Neil. I think in your response, you have addressed some of the other questions as well. Let me now focus on policy, public policy. And there's one question by Fendi, and she talks about, there's massive land reclamation projects everywhere, and there's negative impact. So what can local authorities do? Similarly, there's another question by an anonymous attendee about control of fisheries. And when you have such high species rich environments, as you talked about, at least in Southeast Asia, but there are not many laws to protect these species or even control fishing. So what's your take on regulation and
okay, sorry, I'm going to have to pull up these questions on my board here. So land reclamation, yeah, what do you prevent this problem? Okay, I guess this is one of the issues we have, particularly here in Southeast Asia, is governance, I suppose. Regardless of whether you're talking about habitat loss or fisheries, it's really governance. So it's there being the will for there to be governance. So whether that be at a national or local level. It's also there being funding to develop governance strategies, whether that be having someone policing fisheries areas. You can have something on paper that someone goes, okay, we're going to create a marine protected area in this area that will protect this species. But if you've not got stakeholder buy-in, so you don't have local people feeling that this is of benefit to them, and they're engaged and part of the solution, then people are going to ignore that. In some places, perhaps more heavily reliant on policing. So Australia is a great example of that, where you have both, I suppose. So I used to work for fisheries in Victoria, down the southern coast of Australia there. And there was a lot of work went on in terms of policing laws that there were out there for fishing. So I guess, look, there's carrot and stick approaches. They're diverse. Again, it's not, every place will have, the situations will be slightly different. I was going to talk a bit more about fishing. There is some within our region. There are huge issues with, illegal, unreported IUU sort of fishing, where you have, fisheries catches taken from where they shouldn't be taken, perhaps people held against their will as part of the fishing crew. It's a whole mess in terms of environmental and social impacts. Look, these are really complex issues, but it's really, I suppose, governance. It's getting buy-in from stakeholders, and it's not an overnight fix. It's something that can take a long time. But you do have examples. The team at JCU in Australia, working, for example, in the Philippines, developing marine protected areas there. A marine protected area doesn't necessarily have to be vast. A lot of the work they did in the Philippines initially was on very small protected areas that may be only hundreds of meters in size. But by having local stakeholder engagement there, they were then able to help local communities. People see, oh, look, this is working, it's achievable. Then someone else does the same thing, and someone else does the same thing. Before you know it, you've got a whole network of small reserves. So I'm not saying that will work everywhere, but yeah, look, it's complex. But yeah, a lot of time it comes down to governance. And the same thing with reclamation. So, for example, in Singapore, reclamation is very much controlled, as is sort of all land use here. So, if you look at, I mentioned that, the URA website, you can have a look at what the plans are in Singapore, sort of 2030 and beyond. But a lot of places, reclamation that's going on is it's perhaps less. It's not policed. It's not perhaps legal in some cases. If it is, how do you determine whether reclamation in that place will have an impact or not? So there's a whole area of impact studies to try and determine, I suppose, if you had several sites, what the least bad sites to place a development would be. So things like that. So I saw the question here. So it mentions relocation. Yeah, so I avoid that wherever possible, because what you get back, you get the bad end of the deal with that, I suppose.
Thanks, Neil. I'm just mindful of the time, and I can see the total number of participants. They may have other things, but I'll take last couple of questions. I'll try to combine them again. Many attendees are interested in knowing what can they do if one of our ex-colleagues says that she's no longer in the tropics, but what are the things that she and others can focus on, try to stop a knock-on effect on the tropics. Denise, says, what can you find as the aspect of one of the most positive changes? In the sense, how can global problem can be changed? And as an individual, what changes they can do, and and others similarly. There's an anonymous attendee also asked, what is it that can be done more effectively to address the problem? So again, there are, I'm sure these are large questions, as you said, large questions with large responses, but something more at an individual level, Neil.
Yeah, again, this is, as I said, so whenever I teach a subject in marine conservation, and you're explaining what various human impacts are, and these lectures can go on for a few weeks, and it certainly could be a bit disheartening when you realize all the problems that there are out there. But I guess that, as individuals, there are differences that we can make. I mean, whether that be by, meeting and discussing and banding together with like-minded individuals to lobby governments, for example, so rather than everything going out there being a sort of a top-down approach from government, a bottom-up approach is possible in some cases where concerned stakeholders can push changes. So I mean, one example of that in the Pacific. So historically, a lot of the tuna, for example, in around a lot of the Pacific, the more isolated Pacific islands, was fished by international fleets. They saw none of the profit. They were unable to have any impact in terms of management. It was all happening off land. But a number of nations, they gathered together a few decades ago and actually pushed back, and were able to develop a sort of regional sort of management network, so that A, there would be a benefit for their nations, but B, they'd also be able to work at managing the resource. So that's one thing is, but I'm appreciative of the fact that, the world we live in, and certainly, the situation we see in a lot of countries around the world right now is that, perhaps governments aren't listening to people as much as they perhaps should be. And it would be difficult in some places to do that. I mean, other things is another thing to do perhaps is, looking at, where your dollar is going. These impacts, if it be, if you buy and eat seafood, where you get your seafood from, is it from a sustainable source or not? If everyone, again, it's not going to happen, but if a flick of a switch, if everyone only were looking at sustainable sources, then the unsustainable ones would sort of start to dry out. Also, I suppose, as an individual, looking what industries, where else your dollar goes to. So a great example, it's not marine, well, of course, it's linked to marine in one way or another, but, the haze in Singapore that we had really, it's here in the region every year with people burning off areas of forest and brushland, for oil palm and a variety of other different, farming to be put in its place. There was a real pushback, I remember, in Singapore against some of the paper companies that were heavily invested in some of the places where these type of practices were going on. So I mean, there's the more sort of direct getting involved yourself, lobbying, perhaps even joining NGOs. Maybe if there's a gap, starting your own local NGO to try and turn things around. Yeah, I think there's a lot of power in the hands of individuals, but yeah, it is difficult knowing how to have an individual impact, I guess.
Thanks, Neil. Probably I'll focus on last two questions. One, I'll combine a couple of questions on education and education institution. So Errol Rosaldo queries that as an education institution, how do you address these challenges? And that has moved now. I was trying to read it, and sometimes it happens when the challenges in sustainable management and conservation of tropical marine ecosystems. Along the same lines, another anonymous attendee has questioned, would you suggest a project, and a project that will give a great impact on the coastal ecosystem and the community?
Wow. Well, yeah, I could sit here I could keep this live video on for weeks at an end, and as long as I was caffeinated, keep on coming up with ideas for projects. I mean, look, I'd say for project ideas, it's what is there a need for where you are? Is the particular impact that you want to kind of address? Is there a particular group of organisms you're particularly interested in, if you're looking at a sort of a project. I mean, and any sort of project like this, it's very much blood, sweat, and tears. It takes a lot of dedication, a lot of passion. So, you know, it's really down to the individual a little bit in terms of what area they follow, because there are so many, you know, there are so many different things to be done. In terms of as an educational institution, so as I said, I'm sort of our one sort of marine ecologist here on the Singapore campus. On our main larger campus over in Townsville, and we have a much greater number of marine ecologists, marine scientists, and they're working on a whole range of research, you know, throughout the region and throughout the tropics, in a whole range of different ecosystems, working with stakeholders, working with governments. You know, it's amazing what's going on over there. I guess in Singapore, I mean, obviously the university, you know, we do have a sort of, we do try and do what it says on the tin. You know, the university does have, I suppose, our sort of motto in terms of, you know, making a difference for life in the tropics, etc. You know, and we do follow through that where we can in subjects. So, for example, I mean, there may be, you know, we have a marine conservation. So the degree I teach into is business and environmental science. So that's a degree that straddles, I suppose, that the area that I'm traditionally more interested in, the sort of science and conservation and management side of things, but also includes that other perspective. Because I think that one of the things that's difficult in terms of making a difference is that, you know, different people in different industries in the world, etc. People speak different languages, pretty much. I mean, I talk to, you know, my colleagues in business or psychology on campus, and if they get down into the specifics of their area, I mean, I get lost very quickly. So, you know, by producing graduates who straddle the business side, so they understand perhaps the need for a business to be sustainable economically, a business to be sustainable socially in terms of the people working for that business, but also the other, I guess, leg of the tripod in terms of, you know, how to adapt and change practices to make sure that what they're doing is environmentally sustainable. I mean, that's one way that we do it. And you know, we certainly have graduates, and I've seen who've gone off and worked in a whole variety of different things, and it's always very exciting to hear about what they're doing. You know, some of them have gone more into the environmental side of things, some more in the business, and some of them do straddle that area. And I think those people who are bilingual, you know, are the ones who will really help to bridge the gaps, you know, in terms of you know, making a difference.
Right.
And making people, you know, fully aware. I can harp on about, you know, conservation, the importance of marine ecosystems, et cetera, but someone else is more worried about the bottom line of their business. So, you know, where's that interaction? And I think those interdisciplinary degrees, et cetera, are, you know, important. We've had those for what, 12, 13, 14 years, whatever it is now. And you are seeing more of them as well. I think people are realizing.
All right. So Richard and Vidya are interested in climate change. You know, Richard,
right.
You know, wants to know what factors contributes to climate change, but probably what is the highest, you know, percentage or highest contributor to climate change. Whereas
okay.
Vidya
So I mean, it again, there's a whole range of different activities. But I mean, if you look back and well, there's a few things. If you look at, there's lots of really informative websites out there that inform about climate change. Some of them are very specific to marine ecosystems, some of them more general. There's some really, you know, you look at things like, you know, NOAA in the US, for example. Some really, you know, really informative information out there. There are videos. You know, there's all sorts of information out there. In terms of what's the impact on it, it's us as people. I mean, if you look at, and I don't really think that there's not really any serious scientific debate anymore. I mean, there used to be sort of, you'd have a sort of an interview with, you know, people, pro climate change, there's people anti climate change, etc. I mean, you know, that horse built a long time ago. I mean, the overwhelming, you know, scientific understanding is that, you know, it's human induced. And if you look at, you go back to sort of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and you know, where we started with, you know, burning fossil fuels, for example, you know, where automation and factories started. That's when you sort of really see, before that, sort of CO2 levels were increasing but fairly slowly. That's when you start to see that curve starting, and it's, you know, it's a whole range of our different activities, but, you know, certainly, you know, excess production of CO2. So, you know, electricity generation, you know, how will we power vehicles in the future? All these things you see, you know, on the news, these new technologies, etc., you know, will all go, you know, a way to deal with this. But yeah, I mean, it's, I think, you know, fossil fuels, the fact that we're still so heavily reliant on fossil fuels is well, it's patently ridiculous, and we know what impact that they're having, and the sooner that they're reduced and we move on to other technologies, the better, I think. Again, I mean, look, I mean, said, look, there's a huge amount of resources out there. I'd just have a quick Google search, maybe look at something like NOAA, really informative, you know, written in everyday, you know, language, not sort of dense, you know, scientific research reports, written in everyday language. And if you do get really into it, and you start to sort of get a grip with the terminology and things, then you can look at sort of the international panel for climate change reports and things like that, which have the real up-to-date, up-to-minute information.
Sure.
I'm not sure did I answer the question.
Yeah, you did. Probably another one linked to climate change would be Vidya's on climate
sorry,
sustainability.
Oh yeah, yeah. So sorry, let me just find that. Oh, it's a lot. I lost it, I think.
The question is, if you want to.
Oh, is that on the answered list? Let me just have a quick look.
She's asking, how does climate change affects our food, farming and food?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's you know, what we are seeing, you know, whether you're talking about the oceans or whether you're talking about terrestrial habitats on, you know, on land, this is these are global impacts we're seeing. So if you're talking about sort of, I guess, traditional land-based farming, you know, some crops which people have perhaps grown in areas for, you know, huge periods of time, will not be perhaps growable there anymore. Or if there are, it may be because, you know, you've had researchers, you know, tweaking with them in the lab to make them more resilient, perhaps to, you know, higher temperatures, etc. And I guess with the climate change, it's not just higher temperatures, it's that sort of magnitude of changes. It's the fact that, you know, we're starting to notice that dramatic climate events, whether they be sort of typhoons, etc., are on the rise as well. And so yeah, there's a knock-on effect. I mean, I think that some things are more obvious than others, but I think there's probably very few areas of human activity, whether we realize it or not, that if they're not being impacted now, then they will be impacted in some way in the near future. So it's whether we have to adapt, whether things are, you know, whether processes or crops, whatever it may, are resilient to change, or whether we have to adapt and actually change to you know, move forward. I think it's probably going to be a mixture.
Neil, there are a couple of questions. I'm mindful of the time. You know, it's been more than minutes that you have been answering all these questions. So patiently,
yeah, no problem. If people are happy to keep on listening.
Yeah, the questions just keep coming in, and we still have more than 100 participants. So I'll continue. So there are questions on plastic pollution, microplastic.
Right. Yep.
How can we control it? You know, so my apologies if I'm not reading the entire question.
No.
Of them. You know, the impact of plastic pollution on oceans, and then effective ways of addressing that problem? Of course, one would be use less plastic, but as a scientist, what are your views?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, plastics are an interesting one. I guess it's in some way sort of marine plastics and the way they've been, you know, in the news and on the media and wildlife documentaries and things the last few years. It's probably taken the place in people's minds of when we were talking about climate change a decade or so earlier. I mean, they're both still issues, but you know, marine plastics. You know, there's a researcher in Plymouth in the UK who did a lot of this sort of, you know, groundbreaking work on sort of microplastic sort of thing, and it was a real surprise, I think, that you know, just where these microplastics were turning up in some of these most remote places you can imagine in the oceans, and we were finding plastic. And I think the issue there is that it's the plastics we have used. Some of those are being, you know, some being phased out. Some of them, you know, don't break down. They, you know, there are some real issues with them, and given that they're in these systems, it's people come up with the technologies to perhaps reduce their impact. I guess moving forward with plastics, I mean, you know, plastics when they were originally developed, you know, were a solution to another issue almost. And so, you know, materials scientists out there. So, I mean, so Chris, if he's still online, I know he talked about plastics, etc., a little bit in his lecture, his professorial lecture. You know, new materials are being produced all the time. I mean, I guess in terms of personal use of plastics, then yes, you know, there is, you know, trying to phase out, if you try and look at it as personally trying to phase out plastic use, I mean, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, some places more than others. So I think, you know, pushing to, you know, use different types of, you know, plastic materials. I mean, I guess one thing to be aware of as an individual is in terms of, we talk about, you know, biodegradable plastics. And I guess the sort of earlier types of biodegradable plastics would break, you know, if you had a big bit of plastic, it will break down, your plastic bag will break down, but then it becomes these small bits of plastic. They don't disappear. But, you know, there are alternatives now that, you know, break down more to the chemical constituents. There are, you know, bioplastics that are produced sort of out of various roots and various plant types. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, you know, dealing with the plastic pollution that's in the oceans, I think it's because we didn't see it until it sort of hit us in the face. We were just so unaware of the fact that this was even an issue. So I think that, you know, ceasing use of or at least, you know, recapturing plastics that, you know, potentially more of an issue, and then moving on to using other materials is, you know, in the future is probably the way to do it. But in terms of, look, if you're somewhere collecting, you know, doing shore recovery, collecting rubbish off beaches, you know, that side of thing also, that obviously all helps as well. It stops those big bits breaking into the small bits eventually.
Thank you. Last two questions, Neil. Probably this one should be a quick response. That would be, it's a question from Adele Reynas asking, how effective is coral fragmentation method in rehabilitating coral reef and protecting aquatic ecosystems?
Yeah, so look, this is an area that's moving on quite quickly, and I think that, you know, earlier attempts for coral fragmentation, and basically, so coral fragmentation. Sorry, I'm just going to rearrange my hair 1 second. So coral fragmentation. So if you think of a coral that's maybe sort of has almost like a finger-like structure, it's snipping off a bit of that, you know, cementing it onto a surface of some part, and then growing that, and then replanting that out there. That's what people talk about with fragmentation. As a tool in the toolbox, yeah, there's certainly a lot of potential for it. But as a be-all and end-all solution, I would say no, for a variety of reasons. One is that, you know, if you look at coral reefs or coral communities, they tend to be, you know, a healthy coral community. It's very much a mix of a wide variety of different coral types. So, if you have a diverse coral community and you're losing it, which, it's happening, obviously, we see it before our eyes. If you're using fragmentation as a way of, having a new coral community, it's a bit like it's a bit like gardening at the most basic level, the same way that, planting out mangrove or seagrass is. Unless you get that mixture of species, unless you're getting that diversity, what you're ending up with is potentially a large patch of coral that's all one species. Not only is it all one species, it's also genetically identical. They're all pretty much clones of each other. So it maybe doesn't support as much life as a more diverse community would. It's perhaps more susceptible to disturbance, whether that be coral bleaching, whether that be disease, whatever it may be. So yeah, as a sort of single solution, probably not, but as part of the toolbox, I envisage sort of, people working on restoring corals and coral communities, using that, but also using a variety of other techniques as well.
Thanks, Neil. The final question here would be, what do you suggest to future scientists that plan on researching conservation ecology in the tropics?
Wow. I'd probably have to go back to the small me walking around the northeast of England. I think my main thing there was everything in marine environments was amazing. And I wanted to get out of the cold, which is why the tropics probably attracted me so much. I mean, look, it's one of those things that, keeping your interest up. So, areas, whether it's things you see on documentaries or things you see on science websites that captivate your interest, really following your passions, where your passions lie, and because the thing is that what may seem like a really important area of marine conservation, a particular species, say at the moment, maybe you'll have a researcher out there who cracks the issue and is able to solve it, which is obviously what we're trying to achieve. I mean, it's an uphill struggle, but what we're trying to achieve. And in that case, things move on, things change. We become aware of different issues that we weren't aware of previously. I'd really say, look, keep yourself, be aware. If there's some, keep yourself aware of the issues, and get out there in the environment yourself as much as you can, and nurture that connection. If possible, well, come to talks by people like myself. Email us. I'm giving you, for example, another couple of talks in the next month or so, in different forums. Come meet us. I mean, look, we as research scientists are, basically you in so many years' time. Okay, we're all still, fascinated and really engrossed and passionate about what we're doing, and we're more than happy to talk to, the next generation who will be coming after us, because you'll achieve more and you'll do bigger and greater things than we can probably even imagine. So yeah, keep that passion and keep at it.
Well, thank you very much, Neil, for that advice to budding researchers, and I hope I've done justice to all the questions. There were many more questions. I'm sure Dr. Neil Hutchinson would not mind if you reach out to him, send him an email, and he'll be happy to talk to you, send you, about new projects or any of your questions. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers who are working behind the scenes, Erica, Vinay, and Louis, to make sure that the webinar ran smoothly and there was no hiccups. On that note, I thank all the audience. We still have close to 100 participants for your attention. There is a survey which will pop up the moment you leave the leave this webinar, and please do complete the webinar, the survey. And finally, Neil, once again, thank you indeed for this wonderful talk, and more importantly, for responding to all those questions and the range of questions that came to you, and and still you did justice to them. Thank you indeed. And everyone, have a good day.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for listening to me, and hopefully it was informative and useful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.